Hello and welcome to Kaleidoscope Live. We are the Kaleidoscope team from the British Journal of Psychiatry. So we have 3 papers for you this month. We tried an experiment last month going from 2 to 3. We had 0 feedback, so we've taken that as a firm endorsement of our plan to do more science with you. An interesting mix this month. So one looking at a cure for MS, which sounds like a big claim. We're going to have a second paper asking, is mindfulness a load of nonsense? And the third one is, when Harry met Sally, can you be friends with someone you are attracted to? So the first paper, this one feels big. This is a paper in Science, Bjornevik, and it's called Longitudinal Analysis Reveals High Prevalence of Epstein-Barr Virus Associated with MS. So I think most people will be somewhat familiar with multiple sclerosis. It's a waxing, waning neurological condition. It often comes on in your 30s, 40s, 50s. And it's interested medicine and science for quite some time in that it seemed to have a geographical spread. It was more common in some areas than others. There seem to be hints of associations with maybe a viral infection, but that's really hard to check because viruses are really common. And there seemed to be certainly a lag between catching any virus and catching the condition. There's certainly no case that you caught a cold or an infection and you became unwell with it. So this paper is making what sounds like a very big claim. So have we found a cause for multiple sclerosis? So Dan, what's the paper telling us?
Yeah, I think we might have misled our audience because we tagged it as a cure for MS. So the paper says nothing about that apart from in the conclusion, where they suggest that, you know, a sort of an antiviral or targeting seroconversion might be the way to approach it. But nonetheless, the paper's really important, I think, because it's based on prior information. So they've already established that people who have Epstein-Barr or EBV, that appears to be more common. So if you take people who have MS, you're more likely to find they had EBV. So there's this kind of prior hypothesis that's been established by almost pure association in inferential analyses of existing data. And I think it's the same group that did this work. To strengthen a causal claim, you've got to set up an experiment with available data where you can start looking for evidence that it's not reverse causation or that it's not just purely associative. You have to look for something that adds or constructs a causal pathway type explanation. So that's why I was excited by it. And obviously the disease burden from this, you know, debilitating illness, it makes it, you know, clinically really important as well. So here's what they did. So they accessed a sample of 10 million people, and they could do that because everyone serving in the US military has regular blood serum samples taken and stored throughout the course of their active duties. So they have 10 million people that they could potentially access. So EBV's super prevalent in the population. I think it's about 95% of adults have EBV. It's super common, but MS is rather much more rare. So what they did was they took this sample of 10 million people and they identified clinical cases of people who developed multiple sclerosis in roughly a 10-year period. Then what they did is these are all serving or having served military personnel. So then what they did is they went back and for all the people that they identified who had a clinically confirmed diagnosis of MS, and that was about 851 people, I think, they matched them with age, sex, service, and military branch of service and age, so that they could get a decent control sample. So it's fundamentally, it's still a cohort study and it's still retrospective. But this is where again it gets interesting. What they found is that you've got 850, I think it's 851 cases. All but one of those cases of people who had MS, all but one had EBV positive and seroconversion. So that's the first thing. But that confirms what we already know, right? So here's where it gets more interesting. What they had the ability to do is by going back in the history of these people's serum samples for 1,500 matched controls alongside the 850 odd patients with MS, they could go and retrieve the serum samples and they could look for EBV positivity or negativity. And because the serum samples have been archived, they could also look for other markers of disease progression. So this is super exciting. So you go back and you find the serum sample at time 1, the serum sample after the diagnosis of MS and a serum sample halfway between the two. And you do that for the MS patients and then for the matched controls as well. So you get 3 samples per patient. Here's what they found. The paper's slightly hard to read because when you're reading through it, the headline numbers grab your attention. 10 million, a population of 10 million, 1,500 matched controls, 800 cases of MS. But when you dig down a little bit deeper, you find actually the numbers for the analyses, and at least as far as I can divine, the numbers are actually quite a lot smaller. So here's the sort of headline stats, right? At baseline, they had 35 people who went on to develop MS and were EBV negative. In their control group, they had 107 at baseline who were EBV negative. And then they looked at seroconversion rates and then separately the MS versus the control patients. Here's what they found. Of the 35 people who developed MS, 34 who were negative at baseline were positive for EBV. So that's a 97% seroconversion rate. In the control group of 107 people, 54% seroconverted. So roughly speaking, the people with MS were almost certainly going to seroconvert from EBV negative status at the start towards the end, and in the control group, only about half did. So that's pretty compelling. That's, the numbers are small, but they're numbers that are small from a really big population. Then this is where it kind of gets even more exciting, is they wanted to try and establish whether or not there were other intervening markers of disease, because MS is known to, in people who have confirmed EBV, the onset as I think it's a median of about 10 years, 7.5 to 10 years. So what they then did is they took the middle sample and they looked at it for a particular protein that's known to be available or is a marker for inflammation of myelin. So they looked for neurofilament light proteins in the samples, and what they showed was that in people that were EBV negative, who then went on to develop MS, within subject, there's a sudden spike in their neurofilament marker in their middle sample, which is not present in the people who were EBV negative, became EBV positive, and did not have MS. So what they've done there is you've got negative at start, positive at end, subdivided into multiple sclerosis people with multiple sclerosis, and people without. And in the people who developed MS, you see this spike in their neurofilament light chain marker. So that's even more exciting, because not only can you show that you're EBV negative, you then develop an infection and seroconvert at some point. You then develop signs or early signs of neuroinflammation or sort of demyelination, and then you go on to develop the syndrome of multiple sclerosis. So in summary, the paper's super exciting. You need to read it in detail, I think, to really see how they hammer every single argument to provide at least the strongest assertion of a causal pathway that you can get from data like this. So it's pretty robust, and they defend it quite well. It still isn't a true prospective study. It's still essentially retrospective, but they've controlled as hard as they can to try and reinforce the idea that that there is a causal relationship. I think the only thing that's slightly missing from this paper, if I was being super critical, is they've got strong prior data, right? So they've got a prior hypothesis which they could codify. They report a hazard ratio of 32 with a confidence interval of 4 to 245. A confidence interval that wide sort of makes me a little bit anxious about the model that they used. It just made me think maybe it would be nice to analyze this in a way that robustly incorporates prior information. So I'd like to see the paper, reanalyzed using methods where you can actually build in prior information so that you can reasonably test and assert whether or not your prior hypothesis is supported by the data or disconfirmed. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons they're getting such a massive confidence interval on their hazard ratio. But they do, in the discussion, mention that if there were other explanatory factors, they sort of predict that the hazard ratio would drop to 16 from 32. So they do even try and account for that. So overall, it's just a really exciting piece of work, and it's really interesting, even if you're not someone who understands a lot about multiple sclerosis, it's super interesting. So over to you.
Take it on, you're about to speak.
No, I was trying to respond to the chat to make sure that everybody who joined late knew what EBV was, and then it turns out that everybody was doing it at the same time. So thank you for this amazing community effort to make sure that we're all on the same page. Yeah, this paper was amazing, and there was tons of media splash about it. And I think, it's one of those moments when in science you go, oh, you can almost see a new way forward, a new path towards a better, brighter future for something that's really been confounding for us for a long time. Stepping away from the paper slightly, the one thing that I was struck with is that had we been having this conversation 3 years ago, I would have felt really shocked by this connection. But interestingly, because of coronavirus, there's been a ton of discussion about delayed impact of viral infection and disease emergence because of it. And, going back historically to what happened with the 1918 flu and just all of a sudden now, regular folks on the street know that this is possible. So it's amazing to see this connection being made. And I'm interested in the implications of it from your perspective, from the medical perspective. But for me, I went amazing, and that was that.
So one thing to add to that. Oh, sorry, Suki. You
No, go for it, Dan.
Sorry, there's one thing I forgot to mention. Dawn, it speaks to the point you just made. Was they also one of the things they used to strengthen the causal claim was to look at another common highly prevalent virus. They looked at CMV, cytomegalovirus, and they discovered actually that was protective for MS. So I think I understand that's already established, but it was super cool that they included that. So they looked at CMV as another really common, highly prevalent, easily spread, virus, and found that was almost protective for MS. So I think that's, again, it speaks to your point, Dawn, about, when you have viruses that are highly prevalent living in the population, you can actually disambiguate between ones that predispose you to a certain condition versus ones that are either protective or have no increase in risk factor.
I guess I would just pick up a couple of those things. First of all, I kind of think MS is such a devastating disease where how it comes on, people are generally pretty well, and then it kind of comes out of the blue. It's very difficult to establish why it happens. You've got a bunch of environmental or kind of biological factors which might influence it. And in essence, it's interesting that one of the questions, if you say that the Epstein-Barr virus, this kind of member of the herpes family that almost everybody has, so in this sample of 10 million folk, only like 5, it was exactly what it says in the kind of figures. If you open up a textbook, that 5% of people won't have it, but the other 95 effectively will. So if everybody's got Epstein-Barr virus, then why has everybody not got MS, right? So whatever link you're looking at, and this comes back to your small numbers, that because a small number of people got MS in that particular sample, you get these enormous differentials that are picked up in a hazard ratio of 32, where it kind of says, the risk is enormous. It's not doubled, it's actually, by a factor of whatever. And so so one of the temptations when you're looking at that kind of data is to think there's some kind of one-to-one correspondence, that if you have Epstein-Barr virus, then something terrible is going to happen. That's clearly not the case. So I kind of think this looked like it was a good example of looking at very large data sets to find rare events and to find what the differential impact of some factors of interest are on that variable. So I think it answered that question, that definitely there is something in the Epstein-Barr virus which influenced that. Lots of papers would have just stopped there. That would have been a nice epidemiological finding. You've got a timeline that you can follow. So again, that's kind of interesting. And I guess for me, the value was really they really thought about, okay, what other data do we have that can speak to this? So the fact that they decided to look at another member of the herpes family of viruses, this cytomegalovirus, to say that actually, is it just random? Like, is it any old herpes virus will do? And they show no, that effect doesn't hold for that. And then the final thing is, did they have any measures of something that was a relatively non-specific marker of degeneration in neurons? And then so they had this neurofilament light, and they could show that there was a temporal correlation. So something, the bits that you could show was an elevated risk from the EBV towards in that trajectory to MS. And it seems to be mediated by causing some brain damage that you could pick up with this neurofilament S. And there's an interest in using these markers, a bit like the neurofilament light chain, in, is that something that we can use to diagnose, dementia, for example, at a very early stage? Can you pick up damage according to these? And we know with MS that you can usually pick up the lesions on MRI, and they don't always, again, have a one-to-one concordance with symptoms. So you might pick up very early lesions which don't have any effect, and those might occur many years before the actual clinical symptoms arise. So we know that there's a mechanistic chain between changes in the brain and then the illness symptoms arising. And what you can't do with this paper is actually establish what that kind of mechanistic link is. You've got, it feels like you've learnt what that kind of pathway is, but actually you haven't really, because you're not quite sure what intervention would do. So a good example of this is what Dawn raised. So, okay, so what should we do? So normally, if we think that a virus is contributing to a particular disorder, we might think, let's vaccinate, right? So we're going to vaccinate. We vaccinate against EBV, and that should reduce the problem or fix the problem. But if the EBV actually, it's the immune, it's not the EBV itself, it's not the virus attacking neurons, but it's the immune response to the EBV, which also has a secondary effect in terms of attacking neurons, then if you vaccinate, what you're going to do is actually increase the prevalence of the illness, because you're going to vaccinate a lot of people, you're going to cause that immune reaction. If the immune reaction is the problem in the brain, then actually you're going to find out that you've actually caused a worse problem than where you started from. So understanding that kind of the trajectory between the virus, what it's doing to the brain, what that link is with symptoms, can't be done in this kind of high level way. That then requires you to go into the lab and follow this chain of thought up in a little bit more detail. So I think it's a fantastic paper with the links that it makes between these very large epidemiological data sets, and also goes to the trouble of measuring the kind of biological pathway by which that may operate. But within that, there's still quite a lot of missing gaps, and there's no easy transfer to say this is the solution. So even the obvious solution that we should vaccinate is not straightforward.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think it's quite a sophisticated point, because I think the obvious thing to jump to, and it fits as Don's point into COVID, is leading for vaccination, because it produces a mechanism. But you're right, it's not that straightforward. I mean, I thought that was interesting. It made me also think about HPV, which is another illness that there's been vaccination about, that people be aware of, and the data there are really, really strong. So there's been a 90% reduction in some types of cancers in young women who've had vaccination in their teens, but that I think is much better understood. Because it is interesting, EBV has been linked with lots of things, and this is where I think we really don't understand what's going on. So for people listening, there'll probably be a mix of backgrounds. EBV, we've probably almost all had it, and it's been linked with lots of other things, infectious mononucleosis in kids, some lymphomas, but these are all likely to be through quite different mechanisms if it does occur. I mean, it's really not clear what's going on. So in the one sense, it feels seductive that you might have a vaccine that might help lots of different things. But I think you're right, it's not necessarily that straightforward.
I think an important thing to remember here is this sort of a staying in our lane argument. I mean, I'm not a virologist or an immunologist, right? So I have no idea about this. The paper's quite cautious about its conclusions in terms of what might be an effective intervention along this causal pathway. And just looking at it now, they're not suggesting vaccination, but they are suggesting antivirals. So what they're saying is, you know, they're not to provide an inoculation which might interact with your immune system if you have the genetic vulnerability. But they are suggesting that maybe antivirals early in the course of infection might be something that's useful for preventing the virus, you know, getting a stranglehold on your immune system, or at least triggering the immune response that keeps the EBV virus suppressed through your lifetime. So they've been quite cautious about that in their conclusions, which I thought was impressive also.
And did you feel any optimism for direct therapeutics and moving beyond vaccines if we've better understanding about what might be going on in the brain? Did it give you any sense we're closer to direct interventions?
Not to me, but again, I'm not an immunologist, so what would I know? I have no idea. But yeah, I mean, they do conclude their paper with a call to arms for investigating ways to intervene in that pathway. But yeah, sorry, Derek, I can't really give you much more information than that.
It's okay. A lack of knowledge in a topic doesn't normally stop any of us pontificating about it, but I'll take that as a cue to move on to our second paper. And this one is about mindfulness. Mindfulness is really popular, but so is Wordle. But by the way, if anyone's interested, 2 of the panel here play Wordle and on a daily basis update our little WhatsApp feed on it. I'm curious who you think the Wordle players might be, if you want to have a guess at that. But anyway, mindfulness, it's a bit of an industry and it's very popular, and there's been concern about that is it hype, is the science keeping up with it? And the challenge is that mindfulness can mean different things to different people. So it's got its origins in Buddhist traditions, and for many people it still has a spiritual connection. For other people it's less spiritual, but it's maybe a description of a way of life or a lifestyle that's often linked in with meditation and so forth. But here with this, we're looking at something different. It's a cognitive style that can be trainable. And we're looking at a paper, it's by Goldberg et al. It's in Perspectives in Psychological Science, and it's entitled The Empirical Status of Mindfulness-Based Intervention. So that's what we're looking at here, MBI, Mindfulness-Based Intervention. It's not meditation per se. And it's a systematic review, so it's pulling in other papers of 44 meta-analyses of randomized control trials. So what that means is it's pulling in other people's data and trying to amalgamate it. So this is over 300 studies, it's got over 30,000 people to try and pull in best science. And part of the rationale for that is the mindfulness literature more generally has been criticized that sometimes study samples are quite small, there might be biases in who they're recruiting. They're sometimes comparing mindfulness to passive controls of doing nothing. So is that really valid? And this was trying to pull in better data on the topic. Now, we still might unpick how good that data is. And I'm going to do a real high-level summary on it before I open it up to everyone else. I mean, the short of it is mindfulness seemed to be better than doing nothing, but that's a pretty low bar, doing better than nothing. And where there were active controls, it really wasn't statistically significantly better than almost anything. And where it was, the effect size is quite small. And the paper really asks, to me, the question, is mindfulness dead to science? Is it over? Is the jig up? You might like it, but is it actually doing anything? Or maybe to take it a different way, if I think about healthcare and resources and stretched services, so certainly in the UK where we're working, can we justify providing care, mindfulness-based interventions when we really don't have enough people to provide resources more generally? Now, there's a counter argument. We put the studies, of which I think we'll discuss in a second, 300 studies, 30,000 participants. They're looking at lots of different types of problem types in terms of from psychosis to anxiety. They're looking at lots of different age groups, and maybe we need to be a bit better trying to pull out a signal with better designed, larger studies. I think it reaffirmed my bias that I've not been convinced about mindfulness for some time. So my bias is I probably read what I wanted to read, which is I think why I wrote about it in Kaleidoscope. Was anyone else swayed by the paper or irritated by it?
I'll take that. If no one else is going to. So I actually had a slightly more enthusiastic response to this paper than you, Derek. So one thing that impressed me was they restricted it to, one of my problems with mindfulness in inverted commas is it's overused. It's almost become a technology. So like a lot of technologies, you go looking for problems that don't need a solution, right? But you go looking for one anyway, and you try and apply your hammer to anything that looks even remotely like a nail. So the nice thing about it is they were quite careful only to include studies which they described as having a present focus, which is to say one of the key ingredients of mindfulness is to be focused on the present, and which encouraged or directly used rather a meditative practice. And they called that mindfulness-based versus a separate literature they didn't consider, which was mindfulness informed. So they did try and keep the woo firmly out of the arena in doing that. So I was kind of impressed by that, because I thought, well, that at least you're looking at the same intervention, even if it is slightly loosely defined. At least it is something that you can pin a flag onto. And then the other thing that was interesting was that they did it transdiagnostically. So they looked for effects all over the place. And they separated out comparison with passive control versus equivalent treatment. So throughout the paper, they refer to compared with evidence-based interventions, which seemed like a slightly odd way of framing it, but I'm assuming that those were the active controls. So when they looked at those publications which were placebo controlled or passively controlled, they didn't find much in the way of effects across diagnoses. But when they looked at it, they did find large effects. It was the other way around. Then when they compared it in a sort of non-inferiority way or a superiority analysis, so trying to see whether it beat other methods, the effects started to shrink a little bit. So I thought it was a really well-designed paper, and it answers a really important question, because whenever I hear the word mindfulness, I just roll my eyes, because it doesn't feel, I'm not being told something specific enough to make me engage with it. And there is a lot of woo around it. But I thought this was actually quite a useful contribution, because it pins it down. It gives you, this is what we're talking about when we say mindfulness based, not informed, not anything else. And secondly, here's where it works and here's where it doesn't work, or at least here's where the evidence points to a benefit versus no benefit. And importantly, the future directions for this literature, they go to lengths in the discussion to explain what should be done better. And it's all the things you mentioned, Derek. So it's things like, one of the things that really leapt out actually was publication bias, which they really couldn't rule that out. But more importantly for me was the harm associated. So the assumption that a psychologically based intervention is somehow harm-free is something that I think we've come to expect in the last few years, is not necessarily true. I did some mindfulness training when I was a trainee, and in that program, people with psychosis were explicitly excluded from participating because there was an expectation that there was a risk of harm. And that's not been documented very well in the literature. So I was really enthused that they actually did point out that there's an absence in this literature which could be resolved with better design.
Suki, you can step out of your mindfulness and speak now.
No, I mean, I'm a big fan of mindfulness, actually, because I kind of think it's it's simple enough that anybody can more or less use it, and it has a kind of direct effect in the sense that it's understandable that if you just sit around, you're worrying about all the things that need doing, all the things that need to be done tomorrow, what happened yesterday, you carry a lot of baggage. And so if you can have an exercise which just focuses on very much in the present without making judgments, which is a kind of core of the process, I think you can see the value, and most people can use that. And I guess the point that Dan made is that they've asked of quite a different question. It's not really about, is this kind of practice useful in real life? What they've said is, in studies that have attempted to treat quite serious problems with mental health across a range of different things, from depression, anxiety, more general psychiatric things, plus a slightly more ephemeral well-being, and where you've compared that in quite a strict way of randomizing the treatments, does this practice as a treatment rather than as a kind of meditative effort, does it actually make any difference? So for me, that's quite a harsh test of any kind of intervention. And the fact that it survives that and actually says, sure. And in my mind, it may be, or maybe that I didn't read it carefully enough, but I thought that when you compare it to comparing it to an active practice and not comparing it to medication or the more familiar cognitive behavioral therapy type interventions, you're just comparing, you might compare it to like a waiting list or something where it doesn't require a cognitive effort. It shows quite large effects. And unsurprisingly, if you actually compare it to either an evidence-based treatment, I think they include medication in that, or more kind of prototypically something like cognitive behavioral therapy, the effects are smaller, but it definitely still works and seems to be as effective as those things. So on the surface of it, that's unsurprising, because a lot of those psychological practices have elements of focusing away from your thoughts and shifting to different thoughts, being in touch with your emotions, testing out hypotheses, all of which actually require attentional shifting. So if you think of the mindfulness as shifting your attention to the present, all psychological practice or interventions require some attentional processing, whether it's to the current thing or whether you're applying it to a cognitive model that you want to test. So in a way, it's unsurprising that shifting attention is beneficial. Shifting it in a certain regulated way where you've trained somebody to do that is more effective. So for me, it's really good that I interpreted it quite differently from Derek. I thought, this is good. This is as effective as evidence-based treatments. It's as effective as the kind of contemporary things that we have. And it's actually kind of maybe a little bit more understandable, because whenever I'm trying to explain how cognitive behavioral therapy works, I tend to use a kind of sports analogy about how do you improve performance? Well, you can't, if you are pissed off at the fact you've lost a point or the opponent is arguing about a line call, you can't control your emotions. Very, very few people have the ability to just say, okay, I'm not going to let this irritate me anymore. I'm going to switch that off. But the things that you can control are what you do and partly what you think. And so you try and work on ways of changing your emotional state using other things. So that all requires a shift of attention. So for me, this is quite a positive message from this systematic review. And again, I quite liked the idea that they set out a clear set of kind of things that other people should consider when they're running these kind of studies. And some of them are the usual suspects, like it's good to have really large sample sizes that will give you power to see effects. They saying try not just to use self-report items where somebody just describing their experience, but something that maybe is a little bit more objective. And they say, if we want to understand how it works, and this is almost like going back to the last study we looked at, where you can see variables that influence an outcome, they say try and understand what the mechanism of that might be. Look at moderators of the treatment, try and understand who it works for, who it doesn't work for, so we can actually try and tailor it a little bit more, understand what the mechanism of it is. So I think for me, all of that was a relatively positive message. And again, a bit like Derek, it was probably biased by the fact that I think that those kind of the mindfulness practice is actually quite a useful thing just to kind of ground yourself on a day-to-day basis, where you can kind of feel you can start your day in a particular way. Inevitably, it usually goes downhill once the stresses and strains of the day hit you, but at least it's a point where you can start. Over to you, Dawn.
I was going to say, I'm going to jump in with Derek, because actually, well, maybe somewhere in the middle, if I'm being completely honest, but when I read about mindfulness, I'm very aware of my own bias, which I think is a direct result of the fact that it has been so widely embraced and become so popular. So for a moment in time, it's the answer for everything. Everybody's making money on it. It's the cure for all the stuff. And I instantly recoil against that, right? I go, oh man, this is bad. It's going to go bad. And when it makes really bold claims, and Dan brings up a really good point about the fact that there's, potential harm for certain populations. And so when I read it, I always kind of, hold it back just a bit at arm's length. But the point that you guys make is absolutely correct. What I appreciated about the paper was that it set out to kind of separate, using a weird old phrase, but the wheat from the chaff, right? Like it actually tried really hard to make some good operational definitions, to create some good boundaries, and to evaluate what it could reasonably within that space. So that is exactly the antidote to my own biased reaction. That is exactly what I need. And I need more of that sort of very clearly defined, appropriately restrained looks at mindfulness. Because to be fair, just like placebos, just like last time we met, you know, if it works, fantastic. You know, I want that for everybody. I want good solutions for everybody. And so it's not the idea that you have to throw everything out, but what I need to see more of is a good, thorough scientific approach for it, as opposed to this sort of mass adoption. That's where I get a little uncomfortable.
We've been kind of mixed, and it's interesting. The comments too have been mixed through the chat too. So we're going to come on to our final paper, which we're going to do more quickly as a fun piece at the end. So my confession, I've never seen the movie When Harry Met Sally. I've seen the scene. I think that's the point of it as far as I can tell. It's just me being cynical again. And it asks, we're going to look at a paper that asks the question, is it possible to be friends with someone you're attracted to? The paper takes maybe a heteronormative position, so it asks about men and women who are heterosexual. Can they be friends? The paper is Szymkow et al. In Evolutionary Psychology, and it's called Moderators of Sexual Interest in Opposite Sex Friends. So inevitably, we have to put this pressure on Dawn. 3 handsome men surrounding you. How do you cope? And what did you learn from this paper?
Well, we've already determined that my great attraction to you all is your Wordle prowess. So bring it on, right? So this paper, Evolutionary Psych, I'm going to walk you through the paper, then I'm going to break down a couple of points that I think are really important for context. But effectively what they did was they searched for opposite sex friend groups, but both of the friends had to be, first of all, heterosexual, second of all, in committed relationships. So what they were really interested in exploring was almost what is that trigger point for sexual attraction for an opposite sex friend? And it was based entirely around the idea of this thing called a mating activation hypothesis, which from an evolutionary standpoint basically says that the way that we choose our opposite sex friends is an adaptation of the way that we choose sort of sexual mates and partners. And so with all of this said, it's important to recognize the population that was chosen here. It was 146 of these dyads, opposite sex friend group dyads. They don't even mention ethnicity, which usually means everybody was white. And of course, unless you were heterosexual, you were out. So with all of that said, I think we need to take a little bit of restraint when we talk about human behavior, given that this is just a tiny, tiny slice of folks. But anyway, so they did 2 separate studies. The first looked at kind of what effectively the dependent variable was sexual attraction to your opposite sex partner. And to be fair, this is not revolutionary by any stretch, but effectively, the more physically attractive they were, the more sexually attracted someone was to them. Now, again, let's just go ahead and pull this out and say that happens even if you're not opposite sex friends, right? Like that's literally a linear relationship. But hey ho, so they also made sure to be clear that that is much more so for men than for women. And effectively what they looked to see though is what are the moderators? So what is the presence of this current partner, right? So the person you're in the relationship with, what kind of characteristics do they have that might be influencing how you react to your opposite sex friend? And they took a look at a couple of things. They looked at your partner's physical attraction. They looked at your relationship satisfaction. They looked at like financial resource, and they looked at support provided as being potential factors. And effectively what they found was that for women, the current partner's physical attractiveness and their relationship satisfaction was a moderator for how sexually attracted they were to their opposite sex friend. Now, that's the story. Okay, fine. Nothing came up about financial resource at all. So then they develop study 2, which is, no, for sure, based on our hypothesis, we think there should be a financial resource component. So let's go ahead and look at that one more time, but in a different way, but only in women. And with that said, what they did this time was ask about financial resources in a slightly different way. So basically not just, do you have a steady source of income, but, you know, does it seem good? And again, these are undergraduate students. So I've never met one with a good income, but maybe you have. Maybe this is a different experience in a different part of the world. But again, they only looked at women. And so they looked at this idea of financial resource, but they also looked at something they called sociosexual orientation, which is a desire for commitment-free stress, and whether or not someone had a higher sociosexual score meant that they were more interested in they called them sexually unrestricted, but basically, are they interested in casual sex as a thing? And ultimately, what they found was the better the resource of the opposite sex friend, so the more money they made, the more sexual interest was displayed by the women who were their friends. But this was strong for the sexually unrestricted women, but absolutely absent in what they call restricted women. The phrasing kills me. I'm sorry, my eyelid is twitching. It's ugh. But anyway, so the point being that it was basically, it was only if you were interested in casual sex would this have an impact. When they looked at the moderating factors of the current partner, they were surprised to find that this only held for women with high financial security partners. And they go on to say that doesn't support what they were calling the mate switching hypothesis. This is the idea that you're constantly kind of monitoring the value of your current mate. And if they drop too low in value, you might swap them out for someone better. But with that said, so it didn't support this. And they throw a sentence in the discussion that, it's loaded, but it basically says that it's very possible that there are women, in parentheses, low attractiveness, who could not secure a high financial partner, therefore just basically give it up. Anyway, you can see that I've been punked by being assigned this paper because it just kills me in all the ways. But it's heteronormative, it's white, it's cis, it's based on all of these ideas that reduce us to just frankly like the drive to procreate and have sex. I too read The Selfish Gene in undergraduate. It was amazing and totally changed my mind about a bunch of things. But I find this kind of evolutionary stuff really an award for storytelling, and it can be loaded with really dangerous stereotypes. So I very much want to hear what you guys think about it.
Who's going to follow on that?
I know no one's going to take the bait on this one.
No, we threw this at Dawn to wind her up.
Yeah, I think so. It was partly my fault because I wanted to get a line from a Nora Ephron script into a Kaleidoscope column.
That's right. You wrote this piece, Dan. I think you have to follow up now.
Fault.
Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, my reason for picking it was I didn't think the first study was terrible. I accept all of the biases that are built into it. As in I recognize, not accept necessarily, but I don't know. I think for me, the reason it was in any way worth reading or reporting on was that it's an example of where you can fit any evolutionary story to any data you find. And Dawn, your interrogation of study 2, I think actually really, I probably should have paid more attention to that, but that really shows how badly designed the overall study was, right? So when you don't find the effect you want about this idea of your mate has to have evolutionary, selective advantage, and nowadays that's not necessarily going to be the old school physical properties, it's going to be financial security and resource. I mean, this has been an argument in evolutionary arguments for a long time, as I understand it. But when you don't find that, you then go looking for it as hard as you possibly can, and then come up with something like, well, if you're a member of a population where you're really not attractive enough to attract someone who's got a lot of money, well, then tough luck. But that's an evolutionary explanation. I thought that was the weakest part of it. But I'm kind of glad you took this one on, Dawn, because I think you interrogated it with far more rigor than I did when I just wanted to crowbar a funny quote in there.
I think it's a valuable lesson in not trying to crowbar a funny quote, because next time, Dawn might not take it on, and it might be on your door to describe why this study deserved airtime. I don't really have very much to say about this study. I think it's been nicely critiqued. It's got a lot of issues. I think the evolutionary psychology space, I think, is quite an interesting window into looking at behavior from a particular angle. You may like that or you may not like that, but I kind of think it's always useful to be able to look at things in a very from a different direction. I think this is quite a relatively lightweight and underspecified study. I agree. And I think one of the variables that it would have been interesting to look at in addition is there's quite a lot of literature on how people's choices in terms of whether of attractiveness for others and whether they want to have relationships with them is predicated on their self assessment of how attractive they are. And I kind of think that wasn't examined in this study. And I kind of think that's a core feature of lots of these kind of studies, which actually would have made it slightly more interesting, because that again generates a number of hypotheses about where you pitch relative to yourself in terms of what you think is achievable. And again, unsurprisingly, in these very simplistic models, then men always tend to overpitch, and women in this kind of binary system are slightly more conservative aspects. So I think it's very difficult to make any sense of these results, particularly that very complicated kind of moderator about the current partner versus the future partner thing. That I've really struggled to understand what that meant. And then the fact that the results were counterintuitive also didn't help. And then you had to shoehorn an explanation as to why that might be, but you had the capability to look at those variables, whether it's true, whether your own self-worth did influence your decision making, but you chose not to do that. So again, for me, it's quite an interesting example of, if you design your study badly, then don't be surprised that you get a bunch of shit results that are very difficult to make sense of. I think we end it there.
It makes you really appreciate good EvPsych stuff, right? Like when it's done well, when it is nuanced, then it's really cool, and it gives a lot of fodder for very interesting conversation. It just wasn't today.
And I think the comments on the side are agreeing with maybe the real lesson here is about clickbait science and putting movie titles in your papers, and that we were all tricked, we fell for it. Well, thank you for joining us again this month. So I think lessons were on the fence about mindfulness, but can I finish by saying Wordle is not good for you? I discourage it for everyone. But we hope to see you again next month. Take care.